Judy sat alone on the porch of the bungalow, her leg rapidly bouncing up and down. It had been just over a day since V had died, and still, she felt as though she were frozen in a state of shock. Nothing seemed to be truly happening to her. Rather, it was as though she was only observing her life now, expecting to wake up any moment from the surrealistic nightmare she was seemingly stuck in. But she didn't. It was early in the afternoon, and the sun was obscured by a blanket of clouds which covered the sky. It had rained earlier in the morning, leaving with it a blanket of humidity which still clung in the air. Judging from the sky, it would soon rain again. Just a couple hours earlier, Judy's Hollow had buzzed with a series of notifications. The transfer of funds had been completed, as had the transfer of the deed to the studio in Portland. She had stared at the Hollow with a blank expression. The amount of eddies which V had bequeathed to her was staggering, to say the least. It struck Judy that V could have chosen to do anything with the money she had earned doing gigs in her final months in Night City as she had worked her way up, some of them obviously yielding tremendous profits. She could have leased an apartment in an upscale corpo skyrise or set off for any destination of her choosing to live a life of comfort with the time she had left. But instead, V had chosen to spend her final days with her in a modest bungalow on the beach, with a small boat at their disposal, barely scratching the surface of her wealth. But what had captured Judy's attention more than anything was the notification which had appeared in her inbox. A single message from V's Hollow. The message was in a file format which she would need to download to view, but the file name had kept her from doing so. For only when you are ready to let me go. Take your time. Her thumb had drifted over the icon. She wanted to open the message as the memory of releasing V's body into the ocean was still fresh in her mind. But something about it had made her hesitate, beyond the pain she knew she would feel at seeing her face once more. V had intended for the message to arrive after she was gone, and the meaning behind it had seemed deeper. Besides, she didn't feel that she was anywhere close to being able to fully let V go yet. So, Judy had left the cryptic message unopened, even as she knew that similar messages had been sent to the few people V had cared for. She could only imagine the reactions of those who opened them and learned of V's fate, how they must have felt. The only one who would not have been caught off guard was Pan Am. Judy had called her the day before, late in the evening when she had finally made her way back to shore. The pain was still so fresh, and yet the prospect of V's best friend finding out about her death via a pre-recorded message had just seemed wrong. The call had been brief, and Judy was grateful she had not needed to say much. Pan Am had screamed and cried into the phone upon hearing the news, before abruptly stopping herself and telling Judy she would be there as soon as possible. The rest of the evening Judy had spent on the porch, uncertain of what to do. The bungalow which they had made into their home seemed haunted, and was no longer a place she felt she could enter. And so, she had spent the night in the back seat of the Thornton, drifting in and out of a restless sleep as she wavered between fatigue and grief. As she stared out at the ocean in front of her, she was acutely aware that V had been granted her wish and was now a small part of the waves which were crashing against the shore, almost as though she were somehow reaching out to her. And yet, the thought provided her with little comfort. If anything, she felt herself longing for a cigarette as she chewed her nails until the cuticles were nearly bleeding. Rubbing her temples in exhaustion, Judy leaned forward. She felt as though she was drifting in the eye of a hurricane, with no clear bearing on which way to go. The growing hum of an engine from behind the bungalow drew her attention. A moment later, the hum subsided, and Judy heard a car door slamming closed. Pan Am had arrived. With a deep breath, Judy rose from the chair she had been sitting in for hours and stretched her legs as she heard footsteps approaching from the side. Pan Am rounded the corner a moment later, her eyes searching about until they landed on Judy's. For a moment, they stared at each other without moving. Judy could only imagine how she must have looked, wearing the same clothes as she had the day before, her hair tangled and eyes bloodshot with bags under them. Pan Am was wearing a pair of jeans and, Judy noted, a samurai t-shirt, just like the ones that V had favored. Her own hair appeared disheveled, and Judy guessed she must have driven all night without stopping. The silence didn't last long, as Pan Am rushed towards her and embraced her tightly. As she felt Pan Am shaking, Judy slowly wrapped her arms around her, offering what little comfort she could. They stayed that way for several minutes before Pan Am finally pulled away, brushing aside the tears from her cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Judy. Come on," she managed as she gestured towards the bungalow. "Let's talk." Pan Am started to venture inside before stopping, noticing Judy's hesitation. Judy stared at the door. "Sorry, I haven't been in there since." Pan Am's eyes widened. "Oh my God, I'm sorry, Jude. We can stay out here. It's fine, really. No, let's go in. I can't hide out here forever anyway." Pan Am led the way as Judy followed, her arms crossed as she entered the bungalow. The first thing which struck her was the smell. Burnt noodles. Judy had grown accustomed to it as V had relentlessly kept up with trying to cook them to her liking and had never realized just how ingrained the smell had become. She never did get them the way she liked. She stopped just past the doorframe as her eyes glanced around. The bungalow was eerily silent. Everywhere she looked, saw reminders of V's presence. It felt as though V would round the corner any moment. Boxes of uncooked noodles were stacked in the kitchen from when they had last gone shopping together. The blanket V had used to cover herself with in the evenings was draped over a nearby chair, and the couch V had rested upon just a day ago remained in its place. Looking closely, Judy saw a small, pink strand sticking out of it. Her hair. Judy fought back the lump in her throat and forced herself forwards towards the small table where Pan Am had seated herself, her head in her hands. Sitting down across from her, Judy crossed her arms as her leg began to bounce once more. "You want anything?" Judy finally offered. Pan Am looked up at her. "Actually, I could really use a drink right now if you got one." Judy nodded and stood, walking into the kitchen. As she approached the sink, her eyes rested upon the nearly empty bottle of Senson tequila next to it. It had been V's drink of choice, and she had never wavered in her dedication to the spirit. They had enjoyed many glasses together in their time, going through nearly every bottle the Aldecaldos had given them before they had departed. Quickly unscrewing the top, Judy poured a pair of tall glasses as she emptied the bottle before heading back to the table, setting a glass down next to Pan Am before she sat down. Without speaking, Judy reached her glass across the table and clanked it against Pan Am's before they each drank. "How was the drive?" Judy asked. Pan Am looked at her for a moment, caught off guard by the casual question before she chuckled. "Fuck the drive. How are you doing, Judy?" Judy shrugged. "I'm numb, if you really want to know. Probably cried more in the last day than all of my life combined. Just don't have any tears left in me right now. Panam nodded. I get it. A part of me keeps thinking she's not really gone, that she's just gonna walk through the door with that usual shit-eating grin of hers, ready to throw out some gonk idea. But she won't. There was another period of awkward silence between them. Panam glanced around the room as she took another drink from her glass. This is a nice place. Really beats living in a tent. Yeah. V knew what she wanted, and turns out what I wanted also. Judy saw a pained expression cross Panam's face as she set her glass down hard against the wood surface. Panam's eyes quickly darted around the room once more before her eyes settled on Judy's. Where? Panam's voice caught in her throat. Taking a deep breath, she continued, her voice almost fearful. Where is she? Judy looked towards the door. She told me she wanted to be laid to rest, I guess, in the ocean. So, yeah. Panam followed her gaze towards the door before looking back at her. Judy could hear Panam's breathing becoming labored as she nodded her head. Her face suddenly scrunched as she stood from the table. Need a few minutes, was all she could manage as she quickly rushed outside. Judy remained seated at the table, taking another sip from her glass. She understood that while Panam had come to comfort her, that she also needed time for herself to grieve as well. Unsure of what to do with herself, Judy stood and walked towards the window next to the door and crossed her arms. Outside, she could see Panam. She had fallen to her knees near the surf and was doubled over as she cried to herself. Realizing she was intruding on something which was profoundly private, Judy turned away and looked around the room. This isn't my home anymore. Everywhere she looked, she saw memories, echoes of things which had happened and times they had enjoyed in the past. And all of it now seemed to be poisoned by the physical reality of the present. Even the ocean itself, which she knew in the back of her mind was the opposite of what V had intended. Judy sat back at the table and considered what to do next. She had to get out of this place, that much was certain. There was simply nothing here for her anymore. But where would she go? She would certainly need to pack things up before she left, and the task of sorting through all their personals, of going back to their bedroom? Am I running away again? Sighing in frustration, Judy reached for her glass and drained the rest of the tequila. No, this wasn't the same as running away. By leasing the studio in Portland, V had seemed to know that she would need at least some hint of a new future before she could move forward into a new phase of her life, and that it would require a change in her setting. It was a strange irony that, in death, V had proved to be remarkably practical in a way which sharply contrasted the recklessness of her life. Judy looked up as she heard the door open. Panam walked inside, wiping her eyes as she sat down on the couch. The same place V rested at yesterday. The last place she had been here. Leaning forward, Panam rested her elbows on her knees and looked up at Judy. Sorry. Judy shook her head. You don't gotta say you're sorry, Pan. I know this hurts. A lot. Judy looked away as she felt her eyes begin to sting. Yeah, Panam said in a quiet voice. It does. She really was, like a sister to me. It's fucking crazy, actually. A year ago, I was butting heads with Saul trying to get our comms working back at our camp so we wouldn't keep getting hit by backers. I never would have guessed then that some gonk mercenary with a heart of gold would have stumbled into my life and meant as much to me as she did. Judy only nodded as she continued to avert her gaze from Panam, her words becoming caught in her throat. She could sense Panam staring at her. The same goes for you, Jude. The way the two of you were. I'd give anything to feel that way with someone. Even Matt, that fucking asshole. But I meant everything I told you before. You're one of us, Judy. And Aldecaldo every bit as much as myself. You don't need to be alone. You've got a home to go to, if you want to. Judy pondered the thought. She hadn't considered returning to the Aldecaldo camp. How are things at the camp? Judy managed as she turned back to Panam. A small smile spread across Panam's face as Judy realized it was the first time she had seen any hint of happiness in her since she had arrived. Things are really preem, actually. We cut a good deal with one of the nearby towns. We'll do odd jobs for them, fixin' whatever needs fixin', and keepin' other raiders away. And in return, they'll pay us with supplies. Saves us all the foraging and limits our exposure. Besides, the people we're helping seem to be decent folks, I guess. Judy nodded. There was something appealing about returning to the camp, knowing she would be amongst friends and a familiar place. But V's absence would permeate every moment. It simply wouldn't be the same. I appreciate it, Pan. I really do. But I think I gotta find something new. The last 6 months I've been in a whirlwind, going from one spot to another without hardly a moment's rest. Despite that, V, she anchored me in a way. Somehow, in her own crazy-ass way, she made every place a home for me. But with her gone, those places can't be a home to me anymore. Not even with you and the others. As she looked up at Panam, Judy suddenly felt more alone than she had at any time before in her life. How was she supposed to let go of V when everything she knew had been touched by her? She wasn't strong enough. Reading her eyes, Panam stood from the couch and walked over to Judy, leaning forward and hugging her once more. Judy closed her eyes as she felt Panam's hands brush against her back, the gesture reminding her of how V would comfort her. I understand, Jude, but still, just know, you'll always have a place you're welcome at, if you need it. Panam pulled away and knelt in front of her. What can I help you with here? Judy's thoughts immediately turned to the bedroom at the end of the hall. It was the room where they had fallen asleep next to each other every night and awoken next to each other every morning. The same room where V would often lie in bed and re-experience the BD that Judy had created just for her. The room where they had made love together for the last time, just the morning before. As Judy turned her head to look down the hall, a single tear slid down her cheek. All her things are still in there. I can't. The words caught in her throat as she snapped her eyes closed and breathed deeply, forcing herself to not give in to the mounting wave of sadness which was building within her. Panam stood, resting a hand on her shoulder. It's okay, Jude. I'll take care of it. Her eyes glanced around the room. Boxes? In the bedroom closet, Judy noted as she lowered her head. Right. Is there anything you want to keep, or? Judy shook her head as she whispered. No, it all goes. Can keep anything you want, or give it to the others. Think her hollow's still on the nightstand. Okay. You just stay here. Panam searched and slowly walked down the hall, her eyes searching for the bedroom before catching sight of it. Unable to stay sitting any longer, Judy stood, her eyes darting about. The smell of noodles was still stuck in her nostrils. Deciding she needed some fresh air, she walked to the door and went outside. The air was still humid, though a cool breeze was beginning to blow across the sand. The sky remained overcast as a storm slowly rolled across the horizon towards her, and the ocean had taken on a gray tone as wave after wave crashed against the shore. "Are you there, V? Reaching out to me?" Walking across the sand towards the beach, Judy stopped just as her toes dipped into the water. A wave washed ashore, sending water and grains of sand across her feet. Judy stared down at her toes. She could make out small pebbles of varying colors and shapes, and what appeared to be a small piece of coral which had brushed up against her feet. A single drop of water landed into the shallow water, sending a ripple across its surface. A tear. Judy looked up to the horizon as more tears fell down her face. Her chin quivered as she brought a hand to her face. "Damn it, V. I can't do this. I can't do this without you." Another wave washed over her feet. Dropping to her knees, a sob escaped her throat. As she wiped away the tears which were stinging her eyes, Judy looked back down. She no longer saw the sand or pebbles the ocean current continued to wash ashore as her eyes looked past them. Instead, she caught sight of her own reflection. In the pale light, she couldn't make out her features, only her silhouette. A small glimmer of light from her chest caught her eye. Reaching up, she took hold of her necklace. As she did, her abuelo's words suddenly rung in her ears. "It's about finding hope and strength within yourself to weather the storms that cross your life." Judy's mouth opened as she looked out to the horizon once more. The storm in the distance continued its slow trek across the sky, a haze of rain drifting out beneath it. More of her abuelo's words came to mind. "You should have hope and faith in yourself, Judy." Raising up so she was on one knee and supporting herself with her hand, Judy's breath caught in her throat as V's voice came next, the final words she had spoken to her sounding as clear in her mind as the moment she had voiced them. "I have faith in you." Another wave washed ashore and gently rolled across Judy's fingers, the sensation reminding her of how V would weave her fingers into her own. Judy gasped as she suddenly felt a presence she couldn't define. It wasn't something physical, not a person, but rather something which was all around her, within her, filled with love. Clutching her necklace, Judy pushed herself up and rose from the sand, standing tall as the first drops of rain began to splash against the ocean's surface. Raising her face to the sky, she closed her eyes as the cool drops began to crash against her face. As the rain intensified and soaked her skin, she felt a welcome release in her heart as a grin spread across her face. "Thank you, V, for all of it." By the time she returned to the bungalow, Panam had gathered a pair of boxes near the door. Judy drew a suspicious glance from Panam when she had walked back in. She was soaking wet, drops of water falling from her skin and clothes. "You all right, Judy?" Judy smiled as she walked past her. "Yeah, I am, actually." "Good," Panam replied with an odd expression, keeping her eyes locked on her. Judy walked down the hall and entered the bathroom, her eyes briefly catching sight of their bedroom across the hall. Grabbing a towel off the rack, she began to dry her hair. Her personals were still scattered about, and she decided to put them to use one last time. Throwing the damp towel in the tub, she opened the cabinet above the sink. Her eyes drifted across the many hair care products they had brought with them, eventually setting on her clippers. Taking them out, she closed the cabinet and set them down on the sink as she began to comb her hair. When she was satisfied with the results, she stared at herself in the mirror. She realized her hair reflected what her state of being had been for the last 6 months. The tips were still purple, which blended its way into a dark shade of green, before transitioning into a small area of pink, which contrasted sharply with the blue at her roots. V had been right. She looked like a hot mess. Opening the cabinet back up, she scanned the bottles of dye before settling on a color. It was time for a clean break, something which would encompass her entirely and not just reflect the chaotic phase of life she was about to close the door upon. After unscrewing the top, she turned on the sink and leaned her head forward. With a deep breath, she poured the dye onto her scalp and began to work her fingers throughout her hair. When she left the bathroom and ventured back to the den, she saw Pan sitting on the couch looking down at her hollow. When she glanced up, her eyes widened. "Oh, so pink," she said in a surprised voice. Judy ran a hand through her hair, bringing a lock in front of her face so she could inspect it. "Yeah, it was always V's favorite. Thought it would be a good way to, honor her memory or whatever." Pan smiled, though Judy noticed her smile faltered. Studying her face, she saw that Pan's cheeks were red and her eyes were moist. "You all right, Pan? You just... For a second, I thought..." Judy understood. "You thought I was her?" Pan nodded, and a moment later, her eyes clenched tight as her face scrunched up. With a sob, she lowered her face into her hands. Judy rushed over, sitting down next to her and wrapping an arm around her. Before Judy could ask, Pan spoke, her voice filled with frustration as she tossed her hollow onto the ground in front of her. "Just got a fucking message from her while you were gone. Why the fuck did she have to do that?" Judy felt a sharp stab of guilt. She had called Pan the day before so she wouldn't find out about V from a recorded message, yet had forgotten to tell her about the message which was going to find its way to her. "I'm sorry, Pan. I forgot. V told me she had recorded some messages for after. That's why I called you yesterday. I didn't want you finding out that way. Fuck." Pan looked at her. "No, it's not you, Jude. Just... nothing. Don't worry about it." With a deep sniffle, Pan rose from the couch and wandered over to the window. Judy stared at Pan's back as she looked out to the ocean beyond, her arms crossed in front of her. It was slowly dawning upon her that as much as Pan had come to provide comfort to her, she thus far hadn't done the same for Pan. She was V's best friend, a sister even, and she was hurting. Bad. Standing, she slowly walked towards Pan and raised her arm. Pushing aside her uncertainty, she rested it on her shoulder. For a moment, her hand remained steady before the woman beneath it began to shake. The shaking turned more violent before Pan suddenly whirled around and crashed into her, pressing her forehead into Judy's shoulder as she cried. The sight of the hardened desert leader in such a vulnerable state made her own eyes sting, though she still felt a strong sense of control over herself. Judy wrapped her arms around Pan and held her tightly. "It's okay, Pan. I know." She remained quiet as Pan sobbed, allowing her the time she needed to vent her grief. "She said a lot of things," Pan managed in a wavering voice. "But mostly that she loved me like a sister." Judy nodded, keeping a tight embrace around her. "She did, Pan." Pan pulled away, wiping the tears from her eyes. "I know that, but I never fucking told her. She told me the same damn thing the day before you two left also, and I fucking didn't say it to her. Why the fuck didn't I tell her?" Pan's voice had echoed across the room as Judy stared at her, uncertain of what to say. She understood the regret Pan must have been feeling. Even with all the time that they had together, there was still so much she wished she could have told V herself. But in her heart, She knew that what they had felt together had conveyed far more than any words they could ever speak. Pan, she knew. Believe me, she knew it. Words are just words. They're almost always just as useless or meaningless as all the rest of the bullshit in the world we get ourselves wrapped up in. But how you felt? She knew that, Pan, and that's all that fucking matters. End of story. Panam looked at her. Though she was still sobbing, Judy could see her beginning to calm down and get a handle over herself. Still, I really wish I would have told her that. She deserved to hear that. Judy nodded. She heard it where it matters most, Pan. There ain't nothing to regret. She'd be just as pissed at you for carrying any regrets as you were at her for making you parade your bare ass all over the desert. Together, they both laughed at the embarrassing memory, the sound of their laughter a welcome change. Panam took a deep breath and rested her arms on her hips as she looked around the room. So, you said you're gonna look for something new. Any ideas where? Judy raised her eyebrows as she considered the question. She felt as though she should have been more apprehensive about what to do next. She did know that she wasn't ready to make any major decisions, at least not in her current state. But there were some places which she also knew would be off limits. She would never set foot again in Night City, and living with the Aldecaldos would only dredge up too many painful memories. Those places represented her past, and she needed time to figure out where her future would be, and a place where she could discover her future in peace. I think I'm gonna head back up to my abuelas. Stay with them for a while. It was real good seeing them with V. They took to her right away, if you can believe it, my abuelo especially. Panam grinned. Oh, I can believe it. Judy chuckled as she walked over to the table and sat back down, Panam following her. I think going there for a while will help me sort through all this. It'll be a safe place, you know? One where I know I won't be trying to carve out a new home or a future in. More like a transitory space? Not sure if that makes any sense. Judy shook her head in frustration. She felt as though her mind was bouncing in circles. Panam nodded as she rested a hand on Judy's shoulder. It makes perfect sense, Jude. And I'm perfectly fine sounding like a broken record, but my offer will always stand. And not just for a place to call home, but for anything you ever need. You just call. Thanks, Pan. You're a good friend. You too, Judy. An awkward silence passed between them before Panam glanced down at her hollow. I, should probably hit the road in a bit. Took me most of the morning to get down here, but I think I can make it back before midnight if I'm heavy on the pedal. You need any more help packing things up? I only grabbed things from the bedroom. Or I could stick around longer if you want. It was a tempting thought as she knew that the prospect of reminding herself of V in everything which remained could push her right back into grief. But just as she had needed to say goodbye to V, she knew she was also going to have to say goodbye to the place which had been their final home together. No, thanks, Pan. Think I can handle it from here. Panam's gaze drifted towards the boxes on the floor. Are you sure there isn't anything you want to hang on to? Judy shook her head. I've got everything of hers I'll ever need. Panam smiled. All right. If it's okay with you, then I'll throw these in the back of my... Oh, shit! I almost forgot! Judy watched as Panam knelt next to the box and began to open it, confused on what she was doing. As her hands dug through the box, they stopped as Panam looked up at her. I still owed you one of these, being a formal member of the Aldecaldos and all. Thought maybe you might want this one. Panam pulled V's jacket out of the box, its heavy leather crinkling in her hands as she held it out to her. Judy's mouth opened as she slowly reached out and took the jacket. Her chin trembled as she brought it close to her face and breathed in. Catching a faint hint of V's smell which had clung to the leather, she tightened her jaw to suppress the sob which nearly escaped her throat. Clenching her eyes tightly, she cleared her mind before opening them once more. "Thanks, Pan." Pan smiled sympathetically as she picked up the boxes and took them out to her car. While she was alone, Judy slid her arms through the sleeves and pulled the jacket over her shoulders. Though it was not the first time she had worn V's jacket before, this time felt different than the others. It was as though she were taking something upon herself, adding a new piece to her soul which had been absent throughout her life. Pan walked back inside and stopped. "You look like you were born to wear that jacket. V would be proud." Judy managed a smile as she held out her arms, presenting the fit. "Thanks for coming out here, Pan. Means a lot to me." Stepping forward, she embraced Pan. "Promise you'll keep in touch?" Pan asked into her shoulder. Judy nodded. "I promise." Letting go of one another, Pan took a step towards the door. She stopped, hesitating for a moment as though she was going to say something. Instead, she nodded before she turned and left. Judy walked to the window and watched as Pan rushed inside of her car, holding her hands above her head to block the rain, which was now pouring down, and, a moment later, began to drive off. Turning away from the window, her eyes wandered about as the silence of the bungalow took hold, the only sound being the patter of raindrops against the roof. The surge of strength and peace she had found earlier had seemingly vanished. Instead, in its place, Judy was left with a somber feeling of having been cut off and isolated. Alone. Taking a deep breath, Judy wandered across the den and down the hall, her pace slowing as she approached the bedroom. When she reached the door, she slowly raised her hand and rested it on the doorknob before she stopped. Closing her eyes and lowering her head, she steeled herself before she pushed the door open. Opening her eyes, her breath caught in her throat. The room was exactly the way they had left it the morning before. The sheets on the bed were still rustled and tossed about, and the lights they had strung above the bed were still glowing. She had known in the back of her mind that things would certainly be this way, but still, she had been unprepared for the reality of it. Looking over at their dresser, she saw that one of the drawers was slightly agape, likely from when Pan had searched for V's possessions. Judy found herself split. A part of her grateful Pan had taken care of the unenviable task, while another part of her wished she would have seen to it herself. Slowly walking into the room, she once again was hit by a familiar smell which caused her to stop in her tracks. For a fleeting moment, she wanted nothing more than to run from the room, grab her keys, and drive away as fast as she could. "I'm going to leave on my own terms. You're not going to run away, Jude." Opening the closet, she pulled out a pair of empty boxes which were stacked in the corner. Judy then began to take her clothes off the garment rack, messily tossing them into a pile in one of the boxes. When the closet was bare, she ventured over to the dresser and did the same thing with her undergarments. With the box full, she picked it up and marched her way through the den, placing it next to the door before she went back. Grabbing another empty box, Judy went to the bathroom next. Tossing in all her personals, she had nearly filled the other box and placed it on top of the one she had rested on the floor of the den earlier. Opening the porch door, she lifted both boxes, nearly losing one as the box under it crumpled slightly from the weight of the items above. Reaffirming her grip, she walked out of the porch and made her way towards their car as quickly as she could. The rain was beginning to subside. They had parked their Thornton at the side of the bungalow where a wide driveway worked its way from the nearby road. As she approached, she became vaguely aware of the sounds of distant traffic. Opening the door with her foot, Judy rested both boxes inside the back seat before she closed it. Wiping her hands off her shorts, she made her way back to the bungalow. As Judy walked up the porch stairs, she was once again hit with the same thought she had experienced the last night they had been at camp. This is the last time I'll ever be here. Opening the door, she set foot inside the den. Her mind wandered back to the first time her and V had entered, the sense of adventure and excitement they had experienced as they explored their new home, calling out to one another from different rooms as they discovered something new. But now, with V gone, all she could see was an empty residence, which someone else would likely be living in soon. Stepping into the kitchen, her eyes scanned about the small space. A burn mark still resided on the stove, a reminder of the first time V had tried to cook noodles. When she had tossed the noodles into the pan, it had caused the boiling water to spill over. V had squealed as she tried to splash water from the sink into the blaze, and Judy had needed to sprint from the bathroom to throw a towel on the flames and extinguish them. Despite having the windows opened so much since that time, the smell had never truly left. Judy meandered down the hall before turning to the bathroom, stopping in the doorframe. Looking at the tub on the far end, another memory came to her. It had been early in their stay, and they had taken one of their first trips on the boat when a storm had rolled in. By the time they had reached the dock, they were both soaked and had to run their way up the beach towards the porch. Judy had slipped and fallen onto the sand, her skin instantly becoming coated in the wet grains as V had helped her up. Once inside, they had made their way to the bathroom to change. When Judy had stepped into the tub and peeled off her clothes, she had been about to turn on the shower when V had said to her in a low, seductive voice to run a bath instead. Together, they had laid in the tub, enjoying the hot water and each other's passion for what must have been hours. Turning away, Judy went across the hall and took a final look into their bedroom. As she felt her stomach begin to twist into a knot and a lump rise in her throat, she took a step inside. They had spent every night together since they had arrived in this room, sleeping in the same bed next to one another. Judy's mouth opened and she felt her eyes water as her thoughts drifted back to their last night together, the way V had made love to her for the last time. Looking up at the lights which still glowed, Judy stepped forward and tore them down in a swift motion. Wrapping them into a ball, she took a final look at the bed. "Goodbye, V," she managed before she turned and left. As she worked her way down the hall, she found the strength in her steps returning as her pace quickened. Not stopping as she walked past the table, she reached her hand down and grabbed hold of her keys, scraping them against the wood surface as she continued. Opening the door, Judy walked away from the bungalow for the last time and made her way to the car. Opening the door, she sat down, hastily throwing the string of lights into one of the boxes in the back seat. Inserting the key into the ignition, she started the engine and felt the familiar vibration as it roared to life. Refusing to look back, Judy put her foot on the gas pedal and pulled away. As she turned onto the street, her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she took in the sights of the city around her. When she crossed the border, she would call her abuelas and explain to them everything which had happened. She knew without a doubt they would take her in, as they always had, and she would use the time with them to center herself and decide what the next phase of her life would be. As she drove, the road curved its way around a bend as she passed the last of the city, the landscape around her taking hold. Looking out the window, she caught sight of the coast once more. Though the sky remained cloudy overhead, the sun was beginning to peek its way through far out on the horizon. Reflecting upon her time with V, a smile slowly creeped across Judy's lips. She had always marked time in phases, but as she closed upon the end of this most recent one, she felt completely different than all the others before it. There was no sense of disappointment or regret. She knew there would be hard days ahead, moments where her grief would rise up and threaten to overwhelm her. But she also knew their love had been real and would stay with her for the rest of her life. Resting her hand upon her abdomen, an idea began to form in Judy's mind as her smile widened into a grin. Her fingers gently traced across the arms of the starfish which was etched upon her skin. At the time, it had simply been a way of emblazoning the memory of laying under the stars with V, nothing more. But it was V who had given it so much more meaning with the two simple words she had added. Those words had come to represent more than just a memory, and even more than the literal promise she had made. They represented a commitment they had made to each other to live and fight for every day the sun rose. Taking hold of the necklace which hung around her neck, Judy felt a twinge of excitement as she ventured towards her uncertain future, full of possibilities. Whispering those two familiar words with more conviction than she ever had before, she could think of no better affirmation of their love. I promise